All right, good morning. Make sure I'm in the picture. This is Lynx. I want to do another video here on Lenormand. Quickly, my history with Lenormand comes from when I was doing historical reenacting and I was lecturing in historical parks, and I was always on the lookout for a deck that fit into the aesthetic of the 19th century parks that I was working at. And years ago on a website, I don't know, maybe about a decade ago now, I found this little, just plain, very plain Lenormand deck. And the only experience I ever had with it was that deck. I saw it, I thought it was cool. I knew I could read with it, so I ordered it. And the instructions inside had a Grand Tableau, and if you want to know a little bit more about Grand Tableaus, I did a video on a Grand Tableau. And the only thing I knew was I'd lay them out and I just would read them. And then, later I learned a little bit about the houses and how to read cards in the houses and stuff. But it was a historical deck and it had historical limitations, or rather, perhaps some anachronistic meanings that maybe we should update. So, my point for this video is that when you're reading Lenormand, you should get to know your deck and see how perhaps some more antiquated meanings update. For example, this is my Lucky Lynx Fortune Cards, my Lenormand. Years later, after having used it for years in historical venues, I got a sense for some other meanings, some subtleties about it, so I designed my own deck. And for example, the message now, this comes up particularly for apps. When clients come up, the child usually comes up to represent clients. The garden's an interesting one because it has to do with, public venues or being social or social situations. Whether or not something's going to be a more social outcome or whether it's going to be a more private outcome, things like that. The cross is very tricky because the cross usually has to do with not so great things, but this particular cross, the way I designed it equidistant with the 4 dots in it, which would put whatever curse the cross, because a cross was the sign of a curse. It was a torture instrument, and it has always been in history a sign of curse, regardless of what people say, it was a cursing item. So this particular cross with the 4 pieces and suggests the curse is at bay. So I designed this particular card so that whenever there was a negative situation, the medicine for it was on there. This one usually comes up in relation to the clouds, in relation to the mind, how the mind works. So my point of this is that you get to know your deck, whatever deck you're using, and learn the subtleties of what comes up when. And if you talk to the deck, you can get it to tell you some very, very specific things. Like, for example, the mice usually comes up to represent thieves. But it also comes up in situations where people overindulge. So my point is that, whereas this used to be quite common in the 19th century, shipping was much more common than we see it. It could indicate that something is coming through the mail via shipping. It also could indicate commerce, because commerce was how was quite a bit of what was done by sea. It was also very exotic things from other places came through ships, so it can indicate exotic places. Now, those of you who really know how to read know that there's some subtleties, whether it becomes it's a house or if it's actually a card. So, for example, the house of shipping might be subtly or nuanced differences from when the card comes up in another place. Plus, you've got your card combinations, so it might be public commerce or an exotic public event. Let's say it would be a public art installation, maybe. So, my point for this is that, get to know the deck, play with it, and see what the subtleties are. Some people suggest, for example, that the whip means sex. That tells me more about that individual than the card itself. Usually when the whip comes up, it has to do with things that happen day in, day out. So habits. There's also a broom in there, and in the background I have Angela Lansbury from Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and she's holding her witch's broom. So it can also mean that, you're doing the same thing over and over. It's time to clear it out, or it's time for a change. Point of this all is that it doesn't matter what someone else says they mean, and having worked in those historical venues and seeing people who were historical quote-unquote scholars, I got to see a lot of people become very rigid about how they thought history was, which didn't necessarily mean that was how history was. I had read a lot of diaries and a lot of historical accounts about Midwestern fortune tellers and how they did their thing, and how they were itinerant, and they would go from town to town, and they would set up in someone's house and people would come. And I learned a lot back then, because then I started to portray an individual who did that, and I got to actually have the experience that those itinerant fortune tellers had by sitting down with people and actually reading about all the same concerns that someone would have read about in the 19th century: their family, their loved ones, their love life, their careers, their homes, illness, all those things that someone in the 19th century might have asked about. And I learned a lot about people. People don't change that much, which I thought was the most valuable experience, was that there's patterns to people that are predictable, which is why this works, because this is actually related to the human mind, and the human mind has some of the same qualities that it had back then. However, to be stuck on a 19th century meaning would be very tricky when we have things like apps, So like I said, this one comes up when an app is in play. Like, say someone's doing business through an app. When there's an app that comes through with clients, this will come up with a child. So my point is that, play with it and see how they fall into our current day situations, and those things that perhaps weren't around in the 19th century. Don't be stuck on something simply because it's old. Older doesn't mean it's better. And remember that information that it's in a book is dead. It's dusty and it's dead. And what I'm suggesting is a dynamic approach to interacting with the cards and seeing how they come up in a situation. Someone can tell you over and over and over and over again that the whip means sex. But no matter how many times someone tells me that, that doesn't really come up in that way in my readings, because that's not really how I think of sex. And so these things don't come up in my subconscious language to represent that. It could come up for an individual who's masochistic, however, and I do see people who have these relationships, or these people who are insistent on certain things, sometimes come up with the whip because they want to dominate or control a situation, and that is something that the whip comes up for. So if an individual says that this is the card that represents sex, it usually tells me that they like to dominate, they themselves like to dominate, or try to be in control, or micromanage a situation when it comes to sexuality, which tells me a lot about how they think and a lot about their energy. Think about that as you're doing these things. For example, the fox often comes up to represent a job, but the fox usually in fairy tales was a very, very clever individual, and it usually represents cleverness, examining a situation very closely, and watching out for traps, or trapping yourself in your mind. So what I suggest, from years of reading this without any influence from the outside of anyone, because quite frankly I didn't know about all of these Lenormand people and their groups and their books and all that. I was simply working in historical venues and had found a deck that fit the aesthetic, and was using it myself for many, many years, getting quite great results, because whenever I laid out a tableau for people in Reddit, they were astonished at what it could give me. That said, you can do the same thing. Get yourself a Lenormand deck and start to see how it fits with certain situations, how a representation of a 19th century concept applies to now, and how it tells you specifically what's going on in your world. You can get very specific and very accurate with one of these And so I encourage you to experiment and play and see what the subtleties are of each image. Don't settle with someone else's list of meanings, where it's very, very helpful to start that way. Don't get stuck there, because when you get stuck there, you will become very, very confused. And I've seen it with people over and over again who read these cards in groups or public, or who come to me and ask me. They get very confused about what a meaning is for it, because the traditional meaning says this, and they're not budging in their thought process at all, or being more creative and seeing that that could mean. You have to be clever in this situation. One of the big ones is the woman and the man. When the woman comes up, a lot of times for a man, they'll go, I don't understand, there's no woman in the picture. And I'll say, that's actually representing you and your need to be receptive. That's why I put it as Jack Lemmon, and I made the woman Jack Lemmon in Some Like It Hot, because it's to remind individuals that it's not necessarily specifically about a woman. In some cases, it could represent the receptive side of you, or in the case of a woman who gets the man, Katharine Hepburn, it could indicate that you need to be more projective. So there are a lot of subtleties to these images, and they're archetypal, and they go very deep. And it's a really cool way to read, and you can get very, very specific answers from these by playing around with the combinations and seeing what it's trying to tell you. And it can be very specific. Always use your intuition whenever you're reading. So this whole argument about you can't be intuitive with this method or that method is absolutely silly. If you wouldn't drop your intuition in any other area of your life, why would you drop it when reading cards? I'm Lucky Lynx. I hope this answers some questions that you may have been having about Lenormand. And if I can help you in any way with any questions, please put them in the things below, and I'll do my best from my own experience of reading this for a very long time in very specific venues where it was very much appreciated, the aesthetic was very much appreciated. I'll do my best to answer those questions for you. And if you'd like to get a reading, why don't you email me at conjurehope@gmail.com, or message me through the link here on YouTube, and we'll set something up. Wishing you, as always, success and good fortune in all you do.